talk about ground reference maneuvers. And I thought a really relevant video to show you here. I don't know if you guys will be able to see this since it's Zoom, but it's this this week the LA fires. This C-130 was dropping fire retardant in a heavy crosswind, and you can see the plane is fighting that crosswind by crabbing into the wind. And after he drops the flame retardant, you can see that wind is really pushing him off from our perspective to the left, to his right. The reason we care about ground reference maneuvers is for this situation right here, when we are flying close to the ground and we have a significant crosswind. So we're going to talk about the different maneuvers. We're just going to talk about these three today since we're short on time. All right, let's talk about the rectangular course. The rectangular course is a maneuver in which the ground track of the airplane is equidistant from all sides of a selected rectangle area on the ground. Why do we care? Because it simulates the traffic pattern in preparation for pattern work. Right? So this is what it looks like. We're going to pick a square or a rectangle out in the middle of nowhere, and we're going to note where the wind is coming from. Because the traffic pattern, we care about where the wind is coming from because we try to land into the wind as much as possible. So we'll go out there, check out where the wind is coming from. We'll execute a series of clearing turns just to make sure we're not going to bump into anybody. And then we're going to enter the maneuver at a 45-degree angle to the downwind leg. Now, the ACS says that we have to perform this maneuver between 600 and 1,000 feet. Legally, we have to be above terrain by 500 feet. And the ACS is 600 to 1,000. And you have to stay within plus or minus 100 feet of whatever altitude you pick. So I like to pick 800 feet because that gives you a nice buffer in either direction, and you're not going to bust the ACS standard, and you're not going to bust any legal standards by flying below 500 feet. So 800 feet above the surface is where I like to fly it. You can decide with what you like to do when you go fly. So we're 800 feet above the surface, enter on the 45, and because we're entering on the downwind, we shouldn't really need any wind correction. The wind is just pushing us. We're just moving faster here. If we continue, when we make this turn to the left and we don't make a correction for the wind will blow us off course, kind of like what we just saw with that C-130, right? It'll just blow us off course. If we want to fly the maneuver correctly, we'll actually make a greater than 90-degree turn and point our nose into the wind, just like we saw, and the wind will push us onto the course that we want to fly. Our nose, our thrust, and the wind will work together to keep us exactly where we want to be. As we make the turn to the upwind leg, it'll be a less than 90-degree turn, and we'll fly upwind. We won't need any wind correction in ideal conditions because we're just flying straight into the wind. We'll be a little slower than we are here at the downwind leg, but we'll be flying upwind. And then as we turn to the crosswind leg, we'll do a less than 90-degree turn and again crab into the wind. Because if we didn't crab into the wind, it would push us off course and we would not fly a pretty rectangle. We'd fly some oblong trapezoid. And then when we're turning back to crosswind, we'll make a greater than 90-degree turn to fly the downwind leg. Right. Now, this isn't to say that you're going to be flying uncoordinated. You will fly coordinated. You're just going to fly a heading that will give you a good wind correction or a crab angle. That's a common error. People think that, oh, we need to kick our rudder over. That's not right. We're flying straight and level. We just happen to be accounting for the wind. Right. Like I said before, entry altitude, 500 feet is your legal minimum altitude around sparsely populated areas. The ACS, or the Airman Certification Standard, says between 600 and 1,000, and whatever you decide, you have to be plus or minus 100 feet. So 800 gives you a nice buffer. Right, and selecting a reference point, you want to pick something big and obvious like a cornfield or a square like road system like we saw here, a couple intersections, something big and obvious so that you know exactly what you're going for. Right, and that is the rectangular course. Like we said before, it replicates the traffic pattern. So let's talk about the traffic pattern now. Let's say we are landing in this direction. So we're making left turns. We're going to enter on the 45, 1,000 feet above the surface. Right, here's our downwind leg. We'll turn base and final, and you see it's just like flying the rectangular course. If the wind is Moving in this direction will be downwind. We'll turn base. We'll likely need to crab into the wind. This is a little exaggerated. We'll need to crab into the wind to account for that, crosswind. We'll turn final. Ideally, we'll be completely upwind at this point. And then when we turn crosswind, we'll need to crab into the wind to account for it. Now, this isn't really obvious on calm days because the wind isn't really playing a huge factor, but on super windy days, you will definitely need to pay attention to this kind of stuff. All right. We talked about that already. Cool. And that's the rectangular course. The turns around a point, very similar. The airplane is flown in 2 or more complete circles of uniform radii from a prominent ground reference point using a maximum bank angle of 45 degrees while maintaining constant altitude. Why? This teaches the pilot to maintain a relationship between the plane and the ground, adjust bank to correct for changing ground speed in order to maintain a constant radius, establish wind correction to maintain track, and compensate for drift in changing orientations, and develop awareness that the radius of the turn is correlated to the bank angle. So like we said, the purpose is to maintain a good relationship between you and the ground, to divide your attention between the flight path, the ground references, and your flight controls, and scanning outside and inside the instruments. Remember, 90% of your time should be outside of the aircraft. You should be able to adjust your bank angle to correct for ground speed changes and maintain a constant radius turn. You want to improve competency in managing quickly changing bank angles. It's a 172 or 150. Things are relatively slow, but for somebody who's just learning how to fly, things kind of move a little faster in a turn around a point. You want to establish and correct the wind correction angle to maintain track over the ground, compensate for drift in changing orientations, and develop further awareness that the radius of the turn is correlated to the bank angle. All right, so let's talk about the entry altitude. Like we said before, 500 feet legally. ACS says between 600 and 1,000. That's not 1,000, that's 1,000. And plus or minus 100 feet. So 800 feet is what I like to do. You might select 900 because it's close, it's a little higher, and you still are within that window. In this case, selecting a reference point, you want to select something big and obvious, but not too big, like a barn with a green roof or something, or something obvious, maybe a pond. You don't want it to be too big because then you can just say, oh yeah, I'm flying a circle around that town over there, and then you've got the widest parameters ever. So something balanced, not too small that you lose it, but not too big that it's ridiculous. All right, like before, we're going to do our clearing turns. We'll clear the airspace, and then note where the wind is coming from. Ideally, you want to enter on the downwind. And because your wind is pushing you faster, this is going to be your steepest angle of bank. As you imagine a very strong wind, the wind's pushing you down here. So you need to account for that by making a very steep turn and kind of whipping yourself almost. Don't actually, but that's kind of the way I imagine it. You whip yourself through this turn. And then as you make the turn, it's going to push you further south and you'll need to almost crab into the wind. And then when you are upwind, this is your shallowest bank angle because the wind is just pushing you straight back, right? And then as you continue the turn, the wind will want to push you south. It's going to be slowing you down. So you'll need to almost fly level for a little bit and then steepen up. So it's like whipping you around this circle. Yeah. Good thing to maintain good coordination. And like I said, 90% out, 10% in. Yeah. Let's talk about S turns across the road now. Very similar to the turns around a point, but now we're going to open up that circle and turn in the opposite direction. All right. Entry altitude, all that's pretty much the same. Selecting a reference line. It's going to be a line or a railroad. There's a railroad out where we practice that I like using. Basically a long line now instead of a rectangle or a point. Like we said before, we'll do our clearing turns, note where our wind is coming from, and ideally enter on the downwind. We'll be flying straight and level. As we cross over the road, wings are level. We're going to enter our steepest bank because imagine this exaggerated wind. It's pushing us way beyond where we want to be. We'll have to fly a very steep angle and then roll into a moderate or roll out and get our shallowest angle of bank as we're flying upwind. Ideally, we'll be wings level as we cross over the road, and then because the wind is pushing us and making us slower, we'll have actually a shallower bank angle, and it'll steepen up as we continue this turn. It's a fun maneuver. Actually, I like this one the most of the three. It's the most engaging. The rectangular course is just, straight level, turn, straight level, turn, straight level, turn, right? Turns around a point are kind of neat, but it is just kind of a circle. I like this one because it's constantly changing. I think it's the most advanced of the three. So, oddly enough, most of my students like this one but more than the other two as well. Like we said before, 90% of your time is spent outside, 10% is spent inside, verifying your altitude, turn coordination, airspeed, that kind of stuff. But most of your time should be outside of the aircraft, looking for other traffic, looking at your ground reference point, and just maintaining good situational awareness.